O holy and gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation on all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. For you, O God, you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. We move into this Advent season preparing, looking ahead, anxious for, but not quite yet, Christmas, the birth of Christ and all that comes with that. And so as we move through this season, we thought it might be helpful for us to slow down and maybe think about the most important gifts. Ironically, we have a young woman in our congregation who recently and for the past several years has undergone some significant health challenges. And this weekend she posted on Facebook. It was the first time for her to post in a while because she had been in a coma. She started out with a leukemia diagnosis and all of the different challenges that come after that. She put this on Facebook, so I feel comfortable sharing with you. Then she has been through numerous hospitalizations and on her path forward, and then she was diagnosed with RSV. If you've ever had that, it's very challenging. To hear her describe it, it's 4 hours under a plastic tent, and then 4 hours out, and then 4 hours under, and then 4 hours out for 7 days. And she did fine and came home and then developed a pulmonary embolism. And it was touch and go. It was not clear that she would emerge from this, and yet she did. And she talked in that about her deep desire that the greatest thing is not the stuff that we go buy, not all of the packages that we wrap, but she talked about the true value of simply being present in life with her young family. And so I wanted us to spend some time, historically during Advent, as we're lighting candles, we're talking about hope, peace, joy, and love. We've lifted up these themes year after year. I want us to pay a little bit more attention to the themes this year. I want us to start with hope and what we mean by hope. From our scriptures in Hebrews, we're told that faith is the assurance of things hoped for. And so obviously there are things that we hope for. And if we stop and think about it, hope almost always involves someone else, something else, God's interaction with us, but a reliance from us, an expectation from us upon what will happen outside of ourselves. Is that a fair understanding of hope? The dictionary talks a little differently. It says it's a feeling of expectation and desire for a certain thing to happen. And I can go along with that for a while, but sometimes we're not even certain what we want to happen. We just want whatever it is that's happening now to stop, right? Or to get better in some way, or to move in a new direction. And I think that's a lot of what we find with the Israelites during the time of Isaiah, or in this case, first Isaiah, if you're one of those scholarly types that likes to look into all of that, and there's like 3 Isaiahs. Is that important to you today? We're not going to worry about how many Isaiahs there are, right? We can't even figure out when this book was written. Sometime between the 8th and the 4th century, to narrow it down to 400 years. And it's not necessarily chronological either. But there is in this story some understanding that you and I can have of what the folks are going through. Since the time of King David, in that time after King David, there had been challenges for the people. They'd had kings that were okay, and they had had kings that were not even okay. They'd faced threats from countries all around them, the Assyrians, the Egyptians. They were constantly under threat. And it's in the midst of that kind of walking around, waiting for the next shoe to drop, or just kind of hunkered down waiting to see what hits next. It's out of that Isaiah speaks this beautiful passage of hope. I want you to hear it again. He says, a shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse. You'll recall that that God had promised that there would be someone from the line of David on the throne forever, right? And so David, of course, comes from Jesse, and so the allusion here is that line continues. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him. This is someone who is tuned in to God's will, to God's ways of being, to God's ways of inviting us into being in community. It goes on to say the spirit of wisdom and understanding. Remember, Solomon prayed for wisdom. There's much in our scriptures that talks about the wisdom of the Lord. You and I try to get really smart about things, but that's not the same thing as wisdom, is it? Wisdom is being tuned in and open to the things that God will reveal, right? To learning more about this God who loves us, but not so we can take a test, but so that we can begin to understand on an even deeper level. The spirit of counsel and might. So having this ability to offer good counsel in the midst of the things that come up in life, because if you're king, there's probably people in your kingdom, right? And people have a hard time sometimes getting along. I pray your Thanksgiving was good, right? And so paying attention to God's ways in the midst of the challenges that the people would face. The spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. His delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. The reality is they had had so many before that had ignored the Lord, who had enjoyed the power that they had and had used that power for their own good and had done things that were not good for the people. And maybe they were good for some of the people, but especially the poor were even more marginalized. And so it's in the midst of this that Isaiah is pointing towards this one to come. Now, there's one thing I want you to notice in this passage. Isaiah never tells the people that they have something that they're supposed to be doing to make this happen, right? There's no, if you will go and do this, or, if you'll walk around the building 7 times. There's none of that. It is simply placing before them this image of hope. I was reading, anybody read Guideposts anymore? Or go back and read Guideposts? Guideposts was my childhood. Guideposts was, my parents loved Guideposts, and so they were always around the house, and they really were full of some great stories. So if anybody's going to talk about hope, Guideposts is, right? And so I went back, and I want to share a story with you because the parallels here are pretty interesting to me. It is a story by Chester Gould, and I'm not sure if you know Chester Gould or if I'm even saying his last name right. I'm not going to start at the beginning. I'm going to let you figure out who I'm talking about because it's kind of fun that way. He was asked a question about his life's work, especially a particular aspect of his life that had made him fairly famous. And he goes back and he says, well, I have to go back to the days of the Depression. It was 1931, the Prohibition era. And organized crime in Chicago was at its height. He also lived in Chicago. Almost every day there were stories of gang rides and mob takeovers. It often seemed to me that the forces of good were powerless against this onslaught. At that point in my life, my best efforts to become a successful cartoonist seemed to be standing still. I was making a living as an ad illustrator for the Chicago Daily News, but ambitions die hard, and mine wasn't dead by a long sight. On that particular evening, though, my wife Edna and our daughter had gone to bed. On the couch lay the daily paper where I had thrown it in disgust and frustration. Anybody here throw their papers? Its headlines screamed of another crime massacre. A spring night breeze whispered at the window, and as I sat there leaning back from the drawing board, my mind grappled with the situation. Not a lot of hope sometimes. Who could solve this crime problem? Sherlock Holmes certainly could, I thought. I smiled as my mind drifted back to my boyhood hero. What would he look like today, I wondered. And as I thought, my hand began automatically sketching. Yes, he'd be a sharp-looking young man. Instead of a deerslayer hat, a snap-brim fedora. There, the pencil continued, the face. A firm, square jaw showing determination. The aquiline nose of a searcher. Now the eyes, sharp and analytical. I did not hear the clock strike the hours. 1, 2, 3, as my hero came to life. There he is, crawling over the rooftop on the trail of Big Boy and his gang. He leans over a skylight, trying to catch the words of the gang as they plan their next takeover. Tracy moves closer. Oh no. He falls through the skylight. Strip after strip of daily panels seemed to fly off my easel. As I inked in the final panel of the last strip, daylight filled the sky outside the porch window. At breakfast, I excitedly showed the strips to Edna. She studied them for a moment, then handed them back to me. "It will go," she gasped. "You've got it." And nobody agreed with his wife, Edna. Now, he'd initially called this character Plainclothes Tracy. And so Plainclothes Tracy got shipped all over the place from one publisher to another, including a publisher that Chester had been hounding since he first arrived in Chicago, one who had always said no. He sent those panels to this one publisher who is now in New York. And so it was August 13th, and he was at work. He was working on a rug account, finishing up the details to show the rug's fibers in the advertisement, and the phone rang. It was Edna. "A wire came from you, for you. It's from Captain Patterson, the publisher in New York. Do you want me to read it?" My brain began to go numb. "Please? Your Plainclothes Tracy has possibilities. Would like to see you when I go to Chicago next. Please call Tribune office Monday about noon for an appointment." He said, cold sweat broke out on my brow as I hung up the phone. And the following week, dressed in a new suit and a hat, he walks into his office, and the man's holding his comic strips in his hands, and he's pacing around his office. And he said, "Plainclothes is too long. How about a shorter word for detective, like Dick?" By this time, I had learned that often a dispassionate outsider can improve your best ideas. "Yes, sir," I said. "Okay, Dick Tracy it will be. Have 2 weeks of daily strips ready by the 1st. And so it began. You see, we're always looking for someone. Even if it's just to take us out of our everyday, we're always looking for someone who will come in and bring us a word of hope. As a young cartoonist, this man sat in the middle of Chicago, in the midst of all of the organized crime and all that was happening around him, frustrated, helpless, and hopeless at what could be done. Did he solve the crime problem? No, he did not. What Isaiah did, whether it was in the 8th century or sometime between that and the 4th century, was to provide hope for the people of Israel. It wasn't an unfounded hope. It was a faith-filled hope, but it would take time. And so he reminded the people of their need to not only trust, but to live out of the hope that God would break into their lives in a way that would completely change their circumstances. Friends, do you believe in this hope? I pray that you and I, especially during this season of Advent, but hopefully even after, will look each day for the hope that God has for us. We'll trust each day in God's presence. Amen.